Okay, welcome to our first official unit and lesson of US2. So today we're going to start the progressive era, and the progressive era really is going to be a jumping off point from where you left off in US1. So you might have left off, if this sounds familiar, with industrialization, right? So now that the Civil War is over, the South is, trying to decide how they're going to make money after slavery. And now you have people moving from the South to the North because all of these factories are booming in cities. Well, what happened because of that, right? What happened because the growth of cities? What happened because all of these people were moving, and really Americans were trying to figure out this new way of life, after a war almost tore the country apart. So that is the progressive era. Now, the big objective for today is we're going to look at what issues really defined the progressive era. Where did it come from? What was it? What were the movements? Um, and really, like, what caused all of this to happen, right, during the progressive era? The essential question is, what factors cause society to change? And how do people respond to change? So the progressive era is going to be all about change and social movements and people protesting and rising up. And how does that happen, right, all at once? It's not like they had texts and Twitter and Snapchat to send each other, hey, today is, the day to protest. Right? So how did all of this happen all at once? Why did all of this happen all at once? What caused society to change? And how do people respond to this change? That's the big objective. So first we have to start with the definition. The progressive era was a period of widespread social and political change across the United States from the 1890s to the 1920s. Now, you might have heard this term progressive, like what does it mean to be progressive, especially because this is an election year. And you might have heard the term especially associated with Bernie Sanders and the Democrat Party. Now, progressives believe that all of these issues that society was facing, poverty, violence, greed, racism, could be solved by the government stepping in and providing different services like education, regulations to make sure that working environments are safe and efficient workplace. So progressives really believe that if we want society to move forward, then we have to give people the tools in order to move forward. And progressives mainly lived in cities. We're going to talk about why progressives mainly lived in cities soon. Now, progressives also believed in expanding the power of the government. So we're really going to talk about what the role and power of the government was throughout the progressive era. Now, when we talk about this time period, it's not just one reform movement. There were so many. And you can see how you have Americans who are fighting for civil rights and conservation and government reform and making sure that people had you know, a solid work environment and a safe work environment. You had people who were protesting and gathering for women's rights. I mean, there are so many different movements happening all at once in basically that 35-year time period. So that's really what we are focusing on. Now, why cities? Right? Why did most of these reform movements take place in cities? Well, the population boomed in cities. You have the invention of a safe passenger elevator that made skyscrapers grow taller, or in buildings grow taller. So the higher your building are, the more people you can have in there. And the more people you can have in the building, the more people you can hire. And the more people you hire, the more money your business will make. So it's all this like big circle, right? Also, improvements in transportation. Right. So you had people who now could go out a little farther and find work, right? You could have people who are moving now from the south to the north because you have improvements in transportation. You also have the construction of skyscrapers, like we said before. The taller the building, the more people, the more money you make, right? And then immigration. So immigration is going to boom, and where are these people going to go? They're going to go into the factories and in those buildings. So all of this took place in cities, and I really wanted to show you what the problems were before we talk about them. So, what I would like you to do is I want you to describe this city. What do you notice about the people, the transportation? What kind of problems might people have living in this city? And how are these similar to the problems that people face in cities today? If you are watching this at home and listening to this at home, if you could pause this and write your notes down in your lesson 1 note sheet. So, how did people protest, right? It's not like they, again, like they had, tweets and they had a Twitter to say, hey, yo, today's the day where we're going to protest, right? So, how did people spread the word? Well, they formed unions. And a union is a club or a society or association formed by people with a common interest or purpose. Now, you might have heard of the teachers' union. Which has been in the media lately, especially with schools reopening and such. So a union, the reason why people have unions is because people can gather together who have the same job and they can fight for rights together. They can bargain and negotiate together. So all of these unions are really at the core of these protest movements. So factories, right? Because factories were popping up all over major cities, right? Chicago, New York City, Boston, Philly, right? You have all of these different issues now rising in cities. And one of the major causes of, the poor working conditions is because factories were hiring immigrants. Now, they were hiring immigrants because they were desperate to find a job, right? They left their home country. They're looking for the American dream. They wanted to come to America. Um, so they were looking for these new factory jobs that were popping up in American cities. And because immigrants and poor Americans were willing to do anything and to make any sort of money, factories hired immigrants instead of Americans or Native Americans, meaning Americans that were here before. They they hired these immigrants who were willing to work 12 to 16-hour work days. They were willing to hire immigrants who would work for $8 a week. They were willing to hire children, meaning 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old children, no breaks, no ventilation, no protective equipment. All of these working conditions were horribly unsafe. So years and years and years after this physical and abuse and emotional abuse, basically these people who worked in these factories got together and they were like, enough's enough. So then they formed unions in order to bargain together. So what were the unions during the Progressive Era? There were a lot, but there are 3 big ones that I really want to talk about because you'll see them over and over and over again, and they still exist today. So I think it's kind of cool to look at where these things come from. So you have the IWW, which is the Industrial Workers of the World, and they were known to fight for people who worked in factories. They also wanted to work or fight for people who weren't educated or who were the immigrants, who were women, people who didn't have a voice of their own. So that's really where the IWW and the Industrial Workers of the World focus their attention, right? Getting people who couldn't fight for themselves better conditions. On the other side of that movement, you have the AFL. Now, the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, also protected workers' rights, but they didn't like this whole immigration conversation, right? They thought that jobs should go to American citizens. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to protect the rights of people who were educated, meaning these like skilled workers. So instead of the people who were voiceless, they wanted to make sure that people who did have the education and the skills got these jobs. The last one that I want to talk about is the United Mine Workers. And the United Mine Workers are so important. Next unit, we're going to talk about Chinese discrimination and the poor working conditions that they were working under. But the United Mine Workers, who were Americans, mostly Americans, they were subjected to horrifying working conditions. They were exposed to chemicals and dark places and dangerous equipment, working 20-hour days. So who was protecting them, right? No one was protecting them, and they were putting themselves into these horrible conditions, working for little to no money. And that's why the United Mine Workers, started, because they needed somebody to protect them. So that's why they formed this group. So what you are going to do now is you are going to create your own union. This is also on your lesson one note sheet. So I want you to really think about what it means to be a union, and then I want you to fight for your cause. Again, if you are watching this at home, you are going to put this on pause and you are going to work on this assignment. Okay. So, last class or last lecture, we talked about unions and unionization, but now we really have to talk about what did these reforms accomplish, and really where do we go from here, right? Protesting isn't enough, right? Where do we go from here, and how do we push for this change? So that's what today is going to be about. And again, don't forget, we're looking at what factors cause society to change, right? Why did people just decide all at once, right, to fight for change and to fight for reform and to fight for equity and equality? So what factors cause this to happen? Again, we're going to present our union. So if you're watching this at home, put this on pause and we're going to work on that. Okay, so what was the turning point for the progressive era? When were people just fed up and they thought that they couldn't take anymore and they've had enough with all of this? It was really the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And some of you might know the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire already, but this was really the turning point. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. They're like, enough is enough. I can't take any more. We can't handle anymore. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire happened in 1911, where 145, mostly women and young children, died in a fire. And they were working in a sweatshop. A sweatshop meaning horrible, nasty, horrifying working conditions. The people who owned the factory locked the doors so they couldn't take breaks. There wasn't any sort of air conditioning or breaks to take food or eat food, or breaks to just like breathe breathable air outside. These women and children were exposed to chemicals and they were exposed to horrifying working conditions. But then one day, they're working with textiles, right? They're working with fabrics. And as you know, fabrics are highly flammable. There was a fire, and the fire spread throughout the entire building. The fire ladders couldn't reach the top of the building, so women and children burned in this factory fire. And I want you to think about, you're an average American sitting at home. You have no idea what's going on in these sweatshops, no idea what's going on in these cities, and you read the front page of your newspaper and you see these pictures, which I'm about to show you. You're going to want to protest, right? You're going to want to fight for these people to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And that's why the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is really like one of the main causes of what started the progressive era. So you guys can see here, this is the building. Here's the fire right here. You can see like the burn. Now the fire ladders reached only, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories up. But it was all here at the top of the building. The fire was at the top of the building. So these women, which, like, they had nowhere to go. These women and children had nowhere to go. And I want to read to you an excerpt from a newspaper article that was published about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, just so you can see how horrible the working conditions were. So it says, screaming men and women and boys and girls crowded out on the many window ledges and threw themselves into the streets. They jumped with their clothing ablaze. Their hair, some of the girls streamed up aflame as they leapt. Thud after thud sounded on the pavements. It is a ghastly fact that on both the Green Street and Washington Place sides of the buildings, there were mounds of the dead and dying. From opposite windows, spectators saw again and again pitiable companionship formed in the instant of death, girls who placed their arms around each other as they leapt. And yeah, this is from a newspaper. But it wasn't just major cities. These protests and unions were fighting across the United States, or what was the United States, in the 1890s and to the 1920s. You have people who were subjected to these horrible working conditions. And there was a protest right here in New Jersey, not far from Summit. It happened in 1913. And these individuals worked similar to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. They worked at a silk factory, and they were subjected to the same horrifying conditions. So, like we said in the sweatshop of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, right? No, they didn't have breaks. They didn't have breathable air. They worked on their feet all day. It was young children and women mostly who were subjected to these horrifying working conditions. And not only were they getting paid $8.76 a week, which is about $26 today, who can live on $26 a week today? You had people who were making actually less because there were declining wages as time went on. Now, unfortunately, this protest was unsuccessful, but it really just shows you that it wasn't major cities. And I wanted to show you again, like what people were subjected to in Paterson, New Jersey. So this is from a book called The People's History of the United States. It says, dangerously broken stairways, windows few and so dirty, the wooden floors that were swept once a year, hardly any other light but the gas jets by day and by night, the filthy, malodorous lavatory in the dark hall. No fresh drinking water, mice and roaches. During the winter months, how we suffered from the cold. In the summer, we suffered from the heat. In these disease-breeding holes, we, the youngsters, together with men and women, toiled from 70 and 80 hours a week, Saturdays and Sundays included. A sign would go up on Saturday afternoon, if you don't come in on Sunday, you need not come in on Monday. Children's dreams of a day off shattered, we wept, for after all, we were only children. And again, that's in Paterson, New Jersey. And here are some of the pictures. Here was the protest, and you can see how many people are just out on the streets. This is a mill, and these were the working conditions. And you can see women, they didn't have a place to stand or a place to sit. They were only standing for these 20-hour work days. And as you can see here, who was in charge of the protest? The IWW, which we talked about previously. So, and there's the protest. So not everybody was protected during this labor movement. Now, we talked about the AFL, so people, especially immigrants who didn't have, the proper quote unquote education or the proper training and the proper skills necessary to have some of these jobs. You have the American Federation of Labor who said, give jobs to people who have education and people who are skilled rather than people who aren't. Black Americans, immigrants, women were often not allowed to even go to school to get trained. So that's why you have the IWW who said that if you want to hire people, then you need to broaden your horizons a little, because there are groups of Americans who are literally not allowed to get the education that people want. Interracial unions just did not exist. The country was immensely segregated, meaning separated by race. So what ended up happening is you had, segregation and segregated labor unions, and which means that people often didn't fight for people with like multiple perspectives. So and that's a considerable problem. And what ended up happening during this is the poor got poorer and the rich got richer. And because if you were educated, then you made more money. If you weren't educated, then you made little money. But there was nothing even to like let you get there, right? There wasn't anything that would let you get an education because they banned you because of your gender or your race. So, or where you were born. So this is why, um, discrimination in the labor movement is something we really have to talk about because who you are dependent on what you could do. And this is going to be a common theme throughout the year. So our lesson is done. What I would like you to do is I want you to answer this question on your lesson one note sheet. So, what factors led to the labor movement in the United States? What made this movement happen and possible in the first place? And I want you to name at least two different factors that contributed to the start of the labor movement and the start of the progressive era.